Every year, millions of people go into the American desert, and very nearly every one of them comes back out. They return to their cars and their motels and their ordinary lives, sunburned and thirsty, carrying nothing stranger than a phone full of red rock and open sky. But not all of them, scattered across the vast, dry heart of the West, across the dune seas and the salt flats, the slot canyons and the borderland scrub, the trackless preserves that lie between one interstate and the next. A small and stubborn number of people walk in on a bright, ordinary morning and are never seen alive again. They are not, for the most part, the reckless or the unequipped. They are day hikers and canyoneers, off-roaders and photographers, retirees on a marked loop, and prospectors who knew the ground for decades. They step off a trail to rest their feet, or to find a little shade, or to take one more picture, and the desert closes over them without a sound. What follows is almost always the same. The abandoned car at the trailhead, its doors unlocked. The search that swells from a few rangers to hundreds of volunteers with dogs and helicopters and heat-seeking drones. And then, more often than the agencies like to say aloud, nothing. No body, no gear, no answer. Only a name added to a quiet county list, and a family left to live inside a question that has no bottom. Because the desert does not hide a person the way a forest does, by closing over them. It hides them by sheer scale, by heat and distance and the slow erasure of every track by wind. This is a countdown of 17 American deserts and canyons where exactly that has happened. 17 real places and 17 real people who walked in and did not return. We begin at the foot of the tallest sand in North America, and we end, half a continent away, with the case the desert has never given back. In the south of Colorado, where the San Luis Valley runs flat and pale toward the horizon, the ground does something it has no business doing. It rises, not in the gradual way of foothills, but all at once in a great heaped wall of sand, the tallest dunes in North America, some of them climbing better than 750 feet into the thin mountain air, piled against the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, like surf frozen at the moment it broke. From the valley floor, they do not look real. They look like a trick of the light, or a bank of low cloud that has somehow settled and gone solid, and the people who come to see them, and roughly 500,000 come every year, climb them the way children climb a snowbank, laughing, sliding, sinking to the ankle with every step, leaving behind them a churned staircase of footprints that the wind will erase before the afternoon is out. That is the first thing to understand about this place, and it is the thing that makes it a fitting doorway into everything that follows. The dunes keep nothing. They are made of loose grains and moving air, and they record a human passage only for as long as the wind allows, which is to say hardly at all. A person can walk out across that sand in plain view of 100 other visitors, crest a ridge, drop into the trough beyond it, and in the space of a few minutes become as trackless as if they had never existed. There is no canopy here to search beneath, no brush to snag a scrap of clothing. There is only the sand and the wind, and beyond the sand, the dark timbered flank of the mountains, rising into a wilderness that most of the dune climbing crowd never sees and never thinks about at all. Bryan Skilinski thought about it. He was 40 years old, from the small town of Phoenix, New York, a long way east of the valley, and by the spring of 2017, he already knew this country better than most. Knew it, in fact, from the inside of its worst weather. That February, months before the events that concern us here, Skilinski had gone into the park in the dead of winter with very little gear and had become lost for 5 nights in the cold. He survived. Searchers brought him out, and by the accounts that circulated afterward, he told people he had gone in trying to find some motivation for the next 40 years of his life. It is not for us to interpret that. What matters for the shape of this story is the plain and unsettling fact of it. He went into this place once, in the harshest season it has, and it very nearly kept him. And then, when spring came, he went back. On the 8th of May, 2017, Bryan Skilinski was last seen leaving the sandpit picnic area at the edge of the dune field on foot. When he did not come back, and his vehicle sat unattended where he had left it, the alarm went up, and on the 14th of May, the search began in earnest. It was not a small one. Over the days that followed, it grew to cover something like 14 square miles of the high country beneath Mount Rhoad, up in the Sangre de Cristo wilderness that backs the dunes, National Park Service rangers, search dogs drawn in from 3 separate counties, the Forest Service, a flight-for-life helicopter, fixed-wing aircraft from the state. They worked the drainages and the timbered slopes for about a week, and then the mountain did what the mountain does in a Colorado spring. The wind came up, and the snow came down, and the search was scaled back against weather that made flying dangerous and groundwork nearly useless. Here is the detail that lingers. The country that had to be searched was not, in the end, the sand at all. The dunes are the postcard, the thing everyone photographs. But a man on foot from the sandpit does not vanish into the dunes so much as through them, on toward the wall of mountains beyond. And it was up there, in the steep alpine folds behind the great sand pile, that Bryan Skilinski had gone. Some of the ground the searchers most needed to cover was buried under snow so deep they could not reach it, and so for a time they simply could not go where he was. It was more than a month before anyone did. On the 28th of June, 2017, his body was found high in the mountains near Milwaukee Peak and Marble Mountain, well outside the area where the first, most intensive search had concentrated, in one of the very zones that the late-season snow had walled off. The cause of his death was left to the investigators, and no foul play was ever suspected. The honest and final answer is the plainest one, that a man went alone into high, cold, difficult country and did not come out, and that the ground held on to him until the snow that hid him melted enough to give him back. There is a particular unease in that, and it is worth sitting with before the countdown climbs toward the harder cases still to come. We think of the desert as a place of heat, and most of the 17 places in this film will earn that reputation many times over. But the American desert is also altitude and season, and mountains that stand directly against the sand, and it can kill a person with cold as readily as with thirst, and then hide the evidence under a snowpack until high summer. Great sand dunes is the whole contradiction in one view. A warm valley floor where families sled down the sand in shirt sleeves, and 1,000 feet above them, a winter wilderness that had already tested Bryan Skilinski once and did not let him leave the second time. And the dunes themselves keep their own quieter ledger, the ledger of the vanished footprint. Rangers here will tell you, if you ask, how quickly a track disappears, how a person who wanders out onto the sand at the wrong hour, in the wrong heat or the wrong dark, leaves a trail that the wind takes apart grain by grain until there is nothing at all for a dog or a searcher to follow. That is the thesis of this entire countdown, written plainly in sand at the very start of it. You do not need 1,000 miles of empty backcountry to lose a person. You need only ground that does not remember them. The tallest dunes on the continent do not remember anyone for very long. Neither, as we are about to see, do the identical rock and canyon of a range far to the south, where a marked loop trail can dissolve within a few hundred yards into country that looks exactly the same in every direction, and where an experienced hiker once spent 90 hours without water learning precisely how little the desert cares whether you brought a map. The Guadalupe Mountains rise from the flat, sun-bleached floor of the West Texas Chihuahuan Desert like a jagged fossilized reef thrust toward the sky. To look at this range is to see a paradox of verticality. It is the highest point in the state, a limestone fortress where Guadalupe Peak reaches 8,751 feet. Yet it is simultaneously a desert of extreme, unforgiving dryness. The wind here is not merely weather, it is a permanent resident, often whipping through the high-altitude passes at 50 to 90 miles per hour, scouring the soil until only the white, sun-blasted rock remains. It is a place of profound, austere beauty, where the silence is absolute, and the trails are thin ribbons of dirt that seem to melt into the surrounding limestone ridges the moment a hiker steps 5 paces away from the path. This is a landscape designed to confuse the eye, where every ridge looks like the last, and every drainage leads into a labyrinth of identical, steep-walled canyons. For the vast majority who visit, the Guadalupe Mountains offer a challenge of physical endurance, a grueling hike to the top of Texas, or a trek through the high country basins. But for a few, the park becomes something else entirely, a place where a singular, split-second error transforms a routine day hike into a struggle against the most indifferent geography in the American West. The volatility of this terrain was laid bare in November 2023, when 71-year-old Rick Berry set out from the remote Dog Canyon Ranger Station. He was an experienced hiker, intending to complete a 10-mile loop that would take him through the high, timbered sections of the park. It was a route he understood, yet the desert does not care for experience. Somewhere near the Marcus campground, the familiar markers of his trail simply ceased to register. Berry stepped off the path, likely in search of a better vantage point, and in the space of a few minutes, the range's deceptive topography turned against him. He was effectively erased from the map. What followed was a harrowing 90-hour ordeal. For nearly 4 days, Berry was without food, and for the entirety of those 5 days in the high country, he had no water. As the search effort expanded, drawing in National Park Service rangers, a specialized Border Patrol tactical unit, and dozens of ground searchers supported by helicopters, the reality of the situation became clear. The mountains were not just physically difficult to traverse, they were actively hostile to human life. When he was finally located on November 7th, alive but dehydrated and exposed, he was treated for the extreme physiological toll of his survival. He had been one of the lucky ones. He had survived the silence of the high basins, the plummeting nighttime temperatures, and the absolute lack of hydration that claims so many others who wander off trail in the West. He was flown to a hospital in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and the incident was entered into the record as a near miss, a testament to the fact that in the Guadalupes, the margin between a story of survival and a recovery mission is vanishingly thin. But the mountain does not always grant that margin. In the same year that Berry was found, the range exacted a far more permanent toll, and it did so with a brutal clinical efficiency that left no room for rescue. On April 29, 2023, 2 day hikers were navigating the steep slopes near the iconic massive cliff face of El Capitan. They were not equipped for a technical climb, and they were not in a place where a human being is meant to be on foot. In a sudden, catastrophic shift of balance, a slip on the loose limestone scree that defines the range, one of the 2 hikers plummeted 500 feet to the base of the cliff. The survivor was eventually reached by a complex, high-risk operation involving Black Hawk helicopters, specialized rope rescue teams, and thermal drones, struggling to maintain stability in a 50-mile-per-hour wind. The victim, whose identity remains withheld by the authorities, died instantly upon impact. It was a stark, quiet reminder that in this desert, the earth is not merely a surface to walk upon. It is a vertical, unstable structure that can fail without warning. This theme of sudden, tragic loss recurred only months earlier, on December 31, 2022, when another hiker was discovered unresponsive on the strenuous Guadalupe Peak Trail. On that day, The park was under a high wind warning, with sub-freezing wind chills turning the summit path into a gauntlet of exposure. The hiker, also never publicly named, was found by fellow visitors in a state of terminal collapse. There was no mystery to the event, no suggestion of something untoward. There was only the cold, the wind, and the undeniable fact that a human body, even one driven by the ambition to reach the highest point in Texas, has a limit to what it can withstand before the mountain simply claims it. These deaths, and the near death of Rick Berry, underscore a singular, unsettling truth about the Guadalupe Mountains. They are a place where the environment dictates the outcome, regardless of the individual's intent. The range is a collection of identical rugged limestone ridges, and once you are off the trail, the landscape provides no visual cues for navigation. Every direction looks like the one you just left. Every shadow hides a drop-off or a drainage that leads away from the search area. The wind erases tracks. The heat of the day drains the body, and the cold of the night finishes what the sun began. It is a place that demands total submission to its marked paths. To deviate is to enter a world where the searchers are as lost as the missing. Berry was one of the fortunate ones. The desert let him go. Not far to the west, along a river that marks the edge of the country, there is a trail with no shade and no water, where the only sign that anything is wrong is a car that has sat too long in the lot. In the vast folded landscape of far west Texas, where the Rio Grande makes its great sweeping arc against the international border, lies Big Bend National Park. It is a place of geologic violence and extreme scale, an expanse of over 800,000 acres, where the Chihuahuan Desert rises into the jagged volcanic spires of the Chisos Mountains. To look at a map of Big Bend is to see a landscape that seems to defy the very idea of human transit. There are few roads, and the ones that exist serve only to skirt the edges of the true wilderness. Within that perimeter lies the Marufo Vega Trail, a 14-mile loop that has gained a reputation among the park's rescue teams as one of the most unforgiving stretches of ground in the entire American park system. It is a trail that exists in a state of permanent crushing heat. There is no shade to be found along its length, no reliable water source to sustain a human body under the relentless, scouring sun. And in the height of the summer months, temperatures here routinely climb well above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. It was into this specific, searing environment that a 24-year-old solo hiker walked on an October morning in 2024. He arrived at the trailhead with his gear, parked his vehicle in the designated lot, and set out into a landscape that, by noon, was already punishing. It was not until the following day, October 27th, that National Park Service rangers noted the vehicle was still sitting in the same spot, untouched and silent, with the desert heat already pressing against the glass. The realization that a person had likely walked into that oven and not walked out triggered an immediate and massive search effort. The scale of the terrain meant that ground teams were essentially helpless against the sheer size of the canyons and the complexity of the rocky terrain. Instead, the search relied on the modern tools of survival: aerial support from the Texas Department of Public Safety, Border Patrol, and Customs and Border Protection air crews, all scanning the canyon floors for any sign of motion or color that did not belong to the gray and ochre of the rock. It was on October 28th, after a harrowing day of searching in afternoon temperatures that were still scraping the 100-degree mark, that the crew found him. He was dead. The official report was brief, devoid of the speculation that often accompanies such tragedies, leaving the reality of his final hours to be inferred only by the proximity of his body to the trail and the furnace-like conditions that had enveloped the entire region. The tragedy was not an isolated event. but part of a persistent and chilling pattern that has come to define this corner of the park. Just over a year earlier, in the sweltering heat of June 2023, the Marufo Vega Trail claimed another group. A 31-year-old man, accompanied by his 14-year-old stepson and his 21-year-old stepson, had attempted the hike when the ambient temperature hit 119 degrees. The 14-year-old boy, unable to continue, collapsed on the trail, succumbing to the heat. In a desperate, frantic attempt to secure help for his family, the stepfather attempted to drive the group's vehicle out of the rugged backcountry, but the exhaustion and the disorientation of the heat proved too much. He drove the vehicle over an embankment at the Buquias Canyon overlook, dying in the crash. The eldest brother survived, but the event left a mark on the park's history that remains difficult to reconcile. In both cases, the names were withheld by authorities, leaving the victims to be remembered only by their ages and the circumstances of their final fatal decisions. There is a profound, quiet horror in the way these disappearances unfold at Big Bend. It is the horror of the idle car. A vehicle parked at a remote trailhead is a silent sentinel, a sign that the person who left it has moved into a world where they are entirely alone. When a search is initiated, it is almost always because of that car, an object of modern convenience left to bake in the sun, a tether to a life that the owner has essentially walked away from without ever intending to. The searchers often find the car before they find the person, and that gap in time, the hours or days between the vehicle being abandoned and the first boot hitting the ground, is where the desert does its work. It is a place that does not wait for a mistake to be made. It simply provides the conditions for a mistake to be fatal. The desert at Big Bend is indifferent to the intentions of those who walk through it. It does not care about the experience of the hiker, the quality of their equipment, or the purpose of their journey. It is a vast, ancient machine of geology and climate that functions on a scale that human biology is not equipped to handle. The rocks do not hold secrets. They hold heat, and the canyons do not echo with anything other than the wind. When a person vanishes here, they are not being swallowed by an adversary. They are simply being absorbed by a landscape that is far older and far more patient than any human life. The heat acts as a catalyst, accelerating the process of erasure until the person is no longer a person, but a part of the geology itself. In Big Bend, the desert at least gives the bodies back. It is a grim, final mercy, but it is one that the families of the lost eventually receive, allowing for a resolution that is as cold as the desert night. Yet, there are other places in the West where the desert is less generous, where the geography is so jagged and so profoundly inaccessible that even when the searchers are close, they can find nothing at all. Farther west, across the dunes and the plains and the broken-down mountain ranges, there is a monument where searchers once stood on a ridge and smelled the dead in the cliffs below. Yet after days of picking through the fissures and the caves, they still went home empty-handed, leaving the desert to keep what it had taken. The Sonoran Desert is not merely a place of heat. It is a place of dense, architectural vegetation that creates its own vertical labyrinths. In southern Arizona, hard against the shifting and porous boundary with Mexico, Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument rises from the valley floor in a series of jagged volcanic ranges. The Ajo Mountains serve as the spine of this preserve, a collection of sheer cliffs, high-altitude basins, and narrow debris-choked canyons that are, in the winter months, deceptively mild. This is a landscape of the organ pipe cactus, a prehistoric-looking species that sends its arms upward like a candelabra, and the towering singular saguaro, which stands in the landscape like a silent sentinel. It is a place that feels simultaneously wide open and intensely claustrophobic, where the light plays tricks on the depth of a canyon, and the eye struggles to find a landmark that does not look like every other ridge, rock, and spine of cactus in the next horizon. On the last day of January 1971, Carol Turner, a 32-year-old graduate student from the University of New Mexico, arrived at the monument. She was an experienced hiker, a student of the natural world, and possessed of the careful, methodical instincts one would expect from a field researcher. She set up her camp, and on the morning of February 2nd, she decided to make a day hike into the Ajo Range. Her destination was Bull Pasture, a high secluded basin perched on a shelf above Estes Canyon. It is a beautiful, daunting place, ringed by steep cliffs and thick, tangled brush that makes off-trail navigation a desperate exercise. Before she left, she did what a responsible, experienced hiker does. She parked her car at the trailhead and left a note on the windshield. It was a brief, practical message, instructing that a ranger be notified if the vehicle remained in the lot by the 4th of February. She never returned to the vehicle. When the 4th passed, the note was discovered, and the alarm was raised, triggering what would become the largest search in the history of the monument. For 2 weeks, the operation grew until it involved scores of personnel, NPS rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers who combed the scrub and the ridgelines with a grid-like intensity. They utilized fixed-wing aircraft to scan the high, inaccessible crags from above, and sent technical climbers to scale the vertical faces of the Ajo Range, searching for any sign of a fall or a misplaced step. They moved through the heat of the day and the cold of the desert night, covering the rugged interior of the basin and the surrounding slopes with an exhaustive, painstaking focus. The mystery of Carol Turner's disappearance is anchored in a haunting detail that has persisted in the records for more than half a century. About 8 to 10 days into the search, teams working within the Bull Pasture Basin reported the distinct, unmistakable scent of decomposition hanging in the air, an olfactory signature that, in the stillness of the high desert, usually indicates that a body is nearby. It was a lead that should have ended the search. It was the kind of evidence that leads directly to a recovery. Yet, despite the efforts of specialized cadaver dogs brought in to track the source, and despite teams crawling through the dense brush and scouring the narrow, lightless fissures of the cliff walls, they found absolutely nothing. The scent remained, drifting through the basin like a phantom, and then it simply dissipated, leaving the searchers with no physical evidence, no trace of gear, and no sign of what had become of the woman who had left a note on her car. Rod Broyles, who served as the chief ranger at the monument during that period, later offered a theory that has stood as the primary, if unproven, explanation for the case. He suggested that Turner, perhaps having wandered from the established path in the complex, brush-filled basin, had become disoriented or injured. In such a state, he reasoned, she might have sought shelter from the plummeting nighttime temperatures of the high desert by retreating into one of the many narrow, deep-set caves or crevices that pockmark the Ajo cliffs. If she had been deep within a fissure, concealed by the very geology of the range, it would explain why the search teams, even those working directly above or below her, could not see her, and why the wind and the topography might have conspired to obscure her presence until it was too late. It is a plausible theory, grounded in the brutal reality of the terrain, but it remains a theory nonetheless. The physical, final truth of the matter was never recovered. The case of Carol Turner unsettles because it strips away the comfort of the lost narrative. She was not a novice who wandered into the desert on a whim. She was an educated, prepared woman who gave the authorities every possible chance to find her by leaving a trail of intent. She vanished within a compact, recognizable basin, and for nearly 2 weeks, dozens of people, experts, trackers, and pilots, looked for her with everything at their disposal. The desert did not just hide her, it seemed to actively frustrate the search, offering a sensory ghost that led to nothing but empty, sun-baked rock. To this day, the Ajo cliffs keep the secret of her final hours, a silent, unyielding monument to the fact that, in the high desert, a person can be mere yards from salvation and still be effectively erased from the map. The Ajo Cliffs never gave Carol Turner up. 2 states west, in a preserve most Americans have never heard of, a single wrong turn at a fork in the trail did the same to a woman who had simply disagreed with her companion about where the car was parked. The Mojave National Preserve is a landscape of profound, unsettling scale, 1.5 million acres of California desert that refuses to be tamed by the interstates that bracket its northern and southern edges. It is a country of abrupt transitions. One moment, the traveler is moving through the Cima Dome, where the world's densest forest of Joshua trees stands in a silent, jagged assembly. The next, they are crossing the Kelso Dunes, where the sand is so fine that the wind produces a low, mournful drone, a sound the locals call singing. Yet, for all its beauty, the preserve is defined primarily by its indifference. It is a vast, arid basin that stretches toward the horizon in shades of dust, iron, and bleached bone, a place where the heat of the day can warp the very air and the cold of the night can snap the spirit. It is here, in the shadow of the Paiute Range, that the desert reveals how easily a human presence can be reduced to nothing. In the first week of June 2008, a woman named Maria Pomona Estrada arrived in this remote corner of the California desert. She was visiting from the Philippines, staying with family in the town of Blythe, and like so many others who come to these dry, high-altitude ranges, she sought only a brief immersion in the wild. She was, according to the varying accounts that followed, somewhere between the ages of 67 and 78, an uncertainty that somehow heightens the tragic clarity of her disappearance. On June 7th, she set out into the Butte Canyon area with a 64-year-old male companion. They were not deep woods survivalists, nor were they undertaking a grueling expedition. They were simply 2 people walking through a landscape that, from a distance, appears almost inviting in its openness. They reached a fork in the trail, a moment that would eventually be identified as the hinge upon which her fate turned. They disagreed on the direction back to their vehicle. In the vast, repetitive geography of the Mojave, such a dispute is not merely a matter of navigation. It is a matter of life and death. The desert is a master of mimicry, creating vistas that look identical in every direction, where every wash, every ridge, and every stand of creosote bush appears as a mirror image of the last. They decided to split up to find the car, a decision born of frustration and perhaps a fundamental underestimation of how quickly the desert can distance a person from the familiar. Maria Pomona Estrada walked into the scrub, and her companion walked in another direction. By the time he realized she was not returning, and by the time he eventually reached help to report her missing, on the evening of June 8th, more than 24 hours had passed. In the Mojave, 24 hours is an eternity. When the searchers arrived, they found themselves staring into a void. The Mojave National Preserve is not a place that gives up secrets. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, working in coordination with National Park Service rangers, mounted an exhaustive effort. At its peak, the search involved 50 people a day, supported by search dogs trained to scent human presence across miles of broken ground, and county helicopters that scanned the washes from above, hoping to catch the glint of clothing or a sign of movement in the shadow of the peaks. They combed the canyons, the ridges, and the hidden pockets of the Butte Springs area, where the terrain is a labyrinth of steep, sun-baked rock and narrow, winding drainages. They looked for tracks, for discarded gear, for anything that would suggest a direction of travel. They found nothing. The search lasted for 6 days, but for all the resources poured into the effort, the desert remained stubbornly silent. There were no tracks to follow, no articles of clothing snagged on the brush, no indication that a human being had passed through the basin at all. The wind that sweeps across the Mojave is a relentless eraser. It fills footprints with silt and shifts the loose, rocky topsoil until the ground looks as though it has never been disturbed. For a woman walking without supplies, without the water necessary to sustain life in a place where the temperature can climb well above 100 degrees, the Mojave is not merely a difficult environment, it is a clinical one. It does not punish, it simply extracts the cost of an error. The fact that she was never found is the most chilling aspect of the case. It is a reminder that in the vast, roadless expanse of the preserve, a person does not have to be hidden by anything more complex than the terrain itself. There are millions of crevices, deep washes, and rock-strewn gullies where a body can lie, sheltered from the sun and obscured from the eyes of a searcher in a helicopter, slowly becoming part of the geology. To search the Mojave is to play a game against a landscape that has had millions of years to perfect the art of concealment. The searchers went home, the helicopters were grounded, and the file on the missing woman from Blythe was tucked into a cabinet. A name added to a list that the Park Service maintains with a heavy, professional silence. There is a hollow, ringing quality to the silence of the Mojave. It is a place where a person can stand on a high point and look out over 20 miles of empty space and see absolutely nothing but the work of the sun on the stone. It is a theater of distance, and it makes it clear that the most dangerous thing in the desert is not the heat, but the conviction that you are close to something. A car, a trail, a solution, when you are, in fact, already standing in the middle of a place where no one will ever hear you call out. The preserve is enormous, and it kept its silence. But some of the most complete disappearances happen in the smallest, strangest ground, in Badlands where the rock itself seems built to hide a person, and where an elderly couple once left a message in the dirt that no one read in time. In the high desert of the San Juan Basin, northern New Mexico, the earth does not merely erode, it disintegrates. The Bisti/Denazin wilderness is a landscape of ancient collapsing clay, a vast scorched basin of petrified wood and hoodoos that stand like jagged skeletal monuments against a sky that seems too large for the ground beneath it. It is a place of profound silence, where the wind carries the dust of the Cretaceous period and the topography is defined by the absence of anything permanent. There are no marked trails here, no established paths to follow across the cracked, crumbling gray earth. To walk into the Bisti is to step into a labyrinth of identical washes and ridges where the horizon never changes, and where the sun, reflecting off the pale, silted ground, can strip the sense of direction from a hiker in less than an hour. It is a place that feels as if it has been forgotten by the rest of the world, a geological graveyard that has stood empty for millions of years. And it is a place where a person is never truly lost, because there was never anywhere to be found. The vulnerability of this terrain is not found in its size, for it is not a massive wilderness by the standards of the West, but in its absolute lack of scale. When you stand in the center of the Badlands, every hoodoo looks like the one you passed 10 minutes ago. Every arroyo looks like the one that will lead you to safety. For the unprepared, the Bisti is a trap of mirrors. It was into this unforgiving monotony that Catherine and Gerald Francis Stukenberg, an elderly couple from Hemet, California, ventured on an October morning in 2025. They were 81 and 86 years old, travelers who had likely seen enough of the American landscape to believe they understood its boundaries. They drove their vehicle to the edge of the wilderness, parked, and began to walk into the heart of the clay expanse. They did not know that the Bisti does not care for experience, or for caution, or for the quiet grace of a life lived long. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the temperature in the high desert, which had been oppressive and dry, plummeted toward freezing. The night in the San Juan Basin is a physical weight, a sudden absolute shift that turns the terrain from a navigable wilderness into an icy, impassable shadow. When they failed to return, the search initiated by the San Juan County Sheriff's Office moved with the frantic urgency that such an environment demands. It is a place where every hour counts, where the ground itself is a factor in the survival of those missing. On October 31st, searchers found Catherine Stukenberg dead on the desert floor, approximately 1 mile and 3/10 from the parking area where they had left their car. She was alone. The search continued through the night, a desperate, concentrated effort against the cold and the darkness, until a sheriff's helicopter finally located Gerald approximately 1/10 of a mile further into the wilderness. He too had succumbed. The investigation that followed was quiet and somber, aimed only at reconstructing the final hours of a life together that ended quite literally within sight of the path they had tried to follow. Investigators found, scrawled into the dry, hard dirt near where Gerald was discovered, a short and desperate message: "Help, husband ill." It was a final, reaching communication, a human attempt to bridge the gap between their reality and the world that had failed to arrive in time. The official reconstruction suggests a tragic and common sequence: a sudden medical emergency that stopped them in their tracks, followed by an attempt to wait, a decision to separate, and a fatal exposure to the plummeting nocturnal temperatures of the Badlands. It was not a crime. It was merely the reality of the desert asserting its indifference over the fragility of the human body. San Juan County Detective Lieutenant Gary Malden, speaking to the reality of the region, would later note that roughly half of all search and rescue call-outs for the helicopter in his jurisdiction are for the Bisti Badlands. It is a statistic that speaks to the deceptive nature of the ground, to the way the Badlands lure a visitor in with the promise of a short, scenic walk, only to reveal that there is no orientation, no point of reference, and no mercy when the light finally fades. There is a hollow, chilling finality in the image of that message written into the dust. It serves as a stark reminder that the desert does not require great distances to claim a life. It does not need cliffs or floods or hidden ravines. It only requires a person to lose their way on a flat, barren plain, and then to be left behind by the sun. The Badlands took a couple who never made it 1.5 miles. But distance is not always the enemy. Sometimes a person vanishes from the top of a single well-marked trail in broad daylight in the time it takes a friend to turn around. The Red Rock country of Arizona's Coconino National Forest is a landscape of violent, vertical beauty. Above the tourist-clogged streets of Sedona, the earth tears open into the deep, sheer-walled incision of Oak Creek Canyon. It is a place where the geography is deceptive. The canyon floor is lush with water and shade, a ribbon of riparian green that lures thousands of hikers into a false sense of security. But the moment one steps away from the creek and onto the rim-climbing trails, the environment shifts. The rock turns into a labyrinthine maze of sandstone spires, dense manzanita, and shadowed side canyons that all look, to the uninitiated eye, identical. It is a place of profound disorientation, where the scale of the landscape can swallow a person whole in the span of a single sunset. The A.B. Young Trail is perhaps the most notorious of these deceptive paths. It is a punishing, unrelenting ascent, a climb that forces a person to gain 1,600 feet of elevation in just over 1.5 miles. It consists of 33 tight, grueling switchbacks that cut into the eastern wall of the canyon, beginning near the bootlegger picnic area and terminating at the East Pocket Fire lookout on the rim. On paper, it is a straightforward route. In practice, it is a filter that separates those who understand the desert's volatility from those who do not. On the afternoon of May 27, 2022, 20-year-old Axel Brugere, a psychology student at Northern Arizona University, arrived at the base of this trail with his friend John Picars. It was a late spring day, the air warm and the light long, the kind of afternoon that feels permanent in the high desert. They began the ascent, pushing through the switchbacks until they reached the top of the canyon rim, It was there, in the open, high-altitude brush of the East Pocket, that the two young men made a decision that would define the rest of their lives. For reasons that remain as opaque as the terrain itself, they separated. Picard turned back toward the trail, intending to descend, while Brugere stayed behind. When Picard returned to the point where they had parted, perhaps 30 minutes later, the clearing was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that a fall had occurred, and no sound in the heavy, thin air of the plateau. Brugere had simply ceased to be part of the landscape. Picard, caught in the sudden, disorienting realization that his friend was gone, attempted to navigate his way back down the canyon's complex, crumbling walls. He eventually became lost himself, wandering through the difficult, trackless side canyons, before finally emerging, disoriented and exhausted, near Slide Rock State Park. By the time he was able to alert authorities, 17 hours had passed. The search that followed was a masterclass in the limitations of human effort against the American West. The Coconino County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Team mobilized immediately, scouring the steep, treacherous slopes of the canyon wall, the dense timber around the East Pocket, and the labyrinthine washes that feed into Oak Creek. They deployed drones, ground teams, and specialized trackers, working under the assumption that a young, healthy man could not have vanished from a high-visibility ridge without leaving a trace. Days bled into a week, then 10 days, then 2. Searchers found small items, a piece of clothing, a scrap of material that might have belonged to him, near the creek, but they were inconclusive. They provided no direction, no path, no narrative of movement. By June 17, 2022, the active search was scaled back to a limited, continuous status. Axel Brugere had become a phantom, a person who had walked into a defined, mapped, and heavily trafficked space and vanished into the silence of the rock. There is a specific cold horror in the way this case unfolded. This was not a wilderness of endless, featureless sand. It was a place with boundaries, with a defined trail, with a known starting point and a known destination. Yet, the canyon acted as a void. The red rock walls, which have stood for millions of years, remain indifferent to the passage of a human life. There is no evidence of foul play, no evidence of a tragic error in judgment that can be clearly reconstructed, and, most hauntingly, no body. The canyon simply held onto him, hiding him in a crevice, or under a thicket of brush, or in the deep, unmapped recesses of the rim rock. The mystery of his disappearance is not found in the supernatural, but in the terrifying efficiency of the terrain. The A.B. Young Trail is a physical manifestation of the desert's ability to turn a human being into a ghost. One moment, there is a person. The next, there is only the heat of the sun on the sandstone, the rustle of wind through the scrub oak, and the absolute, crushing silence of the wilderness. It is the silence that stays with the searchers, the feeling that they were walking over him, or past him, or beneath him, and yet the ground would not yield its secret. When a person disappears in the deep desert, we look for reasons. We look for a misstep, a lack of water, a sudden storm, or a moment of panic. But sometimes, the desert provides no such clarity. It offers only the fact of the absence. It leaves the family with a void where a sun should be, and leaves the investigators with a map that has been checked and rechecked until the ink is worn thin, yet remains as blank as the day the report came in. We are left to wonder about the thousands of pounds of stone that stand between the surface and the truth, and the way the canyon walls seem to close up behind those who enter, sealing their path back to the world of the living. Sedona's red rock has never given Axel Brugere back. Neither has a desert valley in the rain shadow of the Sierra, where a man walked up a single canyon to hide water for a hike he would never take, and a snowstorm erased both him and every clue within 48 hours. To reach Saline Valley is to accept that you are finished with the modern world for a time. Tucked into the westernmost reach of Death Valley National Park, it is a place of immense, quiet brutality. A deep-set basin framed by the crushing, jagged walls of the Inyo Mountains to the west and the Last Chance Range to the east. There are no paved roads leading here, no cellular service, and no reliable water. To drive into Saline is to commit yourself to hours of washboard gravel and sharp rock that can shred tires as easily as paper. It is a land of massive shifting dunes, of ancient volcanic heated springs that bubble up in the middle of a barren salt flat, and of deep, narrow canyons that cut into the mountains like wounds. It is a landscape that feels, to the human eye, as if it were designed for the express purpose of isolation. In the heat of summer, the valley floor becomes a furnace that can shatter the resolve of the most experienced traveler. In the late autumn, it becomes something else entirely, a gateway to a high-altitude wilderness where the temperature can drop 40 degrees in a single afternoon, and where a sudden, violent winter storm can turn a simple morning hike into a struggle for survival against an environment that has no interest in the outcome. It was in this landscape of extreme transitions that Rolin Bruno, a 76-year-old man from Arrowbear, California, found himself on the 25th of November, 2019. Bruno was not a novice to the backcountry. He was a man who understood the rhythm of the desert and the necessity of preparation. He had driven into the valley alone, intending to hike up into the higher elevations of the Inyo Mountains to cache water for a longer, more involved trip he had planned for the following spring. He had told his family he would meet them at the remote Saline Valley hot springs on the 27th. When he failed to appear, and when the sun rose over the salt flats on the 28th, without any sign of him, his family did what they had to do. They alerted the campground host, and the machinery of a major search operation was set into motion. The Inyo County Sheriff's Office, in coordination with the National Park Service, launched what would become an exhaustive, multi-agency effort. They knew the country Bruno had intended to enter, the rocky, unforgiving climb of Hunter Canyon. But the desert, which had been dry and still when Bruno arrived, had already begun to turn. On the 28th of November, a severe winter storm moved across the mountain range, dumping snow on the high peaks and creating conditions that would have been lethal for anyone caught without shelter. The next morning, when the California Highway Patrol attempted to launch their aircraft to survey the canyon, a thick, impenetrable fog clung to the mountainside, grounding the search crews and stalling the momentum they so desperately needed. They went in on foot, they used dogs, they flew when the weather allowed, but the wilderness had already been altered by the storm. Every track, every sign, every possible clue had been scoured clean by the wind and buried under a fresh, blank slate of cold stone and snow. Rolin Bruno was never found. He had walked into the mouth of the canyon to prepare for a return, and he had simply vanished into the vast, indifferent geometry of the Inyos. If the death of Rolin Bruno serves as a reminder of how quickly the high country can turn, the case of Robert Bob Wildener serves as a warning that the floor of the valley is no safer. Less than 2 years later, in May of 2021, the 76-year-old Wildener drove his truck into the same basin, intending to perform some maintenance on an abandoned vehicle he had been tracking near the Warm Springs area. He arrived in the heat of the season, carrying only enough supplies for a short day trip. When he did not return, the alarm was raised, and once again, the searchers descended upon the valley. They found his truck. They found the other vehicle he had come to service, but they did not find Bob Wildener. For 6 days, a massive coalition of search and rescue teams from Inyo and Mono counties, supported by the National Guard and specialized scent-tracking dogs, combed the terrain in the unrelenting heat. By the time the operation was forced to stand down, With temperatures on the valley floor climbing past 105 degrees, no trace of him had been discovered. He had stepped away from his vehicle in a place that seemed, to the casual observer, to be entirely open, entirely visible, and entirely empty. There is a profound, chilling lesson in the loss of these men. We tend to imagine that a person who goes missing must have fallen, or been injured, or drifted into a state of confusion. But the reality of Saline Valley is that it requires none of these things to claim a life. It only requires distance. It requires the fact that in a landscape this large, a person is a speck against a background of infinite, repeating stone. You can be a few hundred yards from your vehicle, or you can be miles deep in a canyon, and the result is the same. The desert does not reach out to hurt you. It simply refuses to provide a way back. It is a place where you are on your own, and the margin for error is measured in inches. Saline Valley keeps what it takes, whether by the freezing onset of a mountain storm or the relentless, baking light of the summer sun. And just over the mountains that wall it off to the south, another range of Death Valley's high country killed a hiker within a mile of his own parked car. Not by hiding him, but by the oldest trick the desert has: a single loose step in temperatures that give no second chances. The Panamint Range rises like a jagged, rusted iron fence along the western flank of Death Valley, a massive tectonic upheaval that separates the burning, sea-level salt crust of the valley floor from the high, arid basins to the west. It is a landscape of violent verticality, where the earth has been shattered into millions of shards of calcified, sun-bleached rock. To stand at the base of Panamint Butte is to look up at a mountain that seems to have no path at all. It is a steep, relentless ascent over slopes of loose, shifting scree that slide underfoot like ball bearings. There is no shade here. There is no water. There is only the relentless, shimmering heat that radiates from the rock itself, turning the air into a distorting lens that makes the peaks appear to jump and sway against the sky. In mid-July, the temperature in the Panamint Valley frequently exceeds 115 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat so intense it feels like a physical weight pressing down on the lungs and turning the act of taking a single step into an exercise of extreme endurance. It is a place that demands total respect, yet it remains one of the most deceptively reachable pieces of wilderness in the entire national park system. On the 16th of July, 2018, Peter Rhoad, a 57-year-old resident of Huntington Beach, California, set out alone into this punishing terrain. He was an experienced hiker, someone who understood the necessity of preparation and the risks of the high desert in the peak of midsummer. He drove his vehicle to the trailhead for the Panamint Dunes, a vast and remote expanse of sand that sits beneath the watchful, brooding silhouette of the Panamint Butte. He left his car, packed his gear, and set out with a clear objective: to climb the massive, rugged spire of the butte. He carried with him a collection of meticulously prepared route notes, a paper trail for a journey that was meant to be a test of his own strength against the mountain. But in the desert, the margin between a triumphant summit and a final, irreversible mistake is often measured in inches and seconds, a reality that the landscape does not advertise until it is far too late to correct the course. When Peter did not return to his vehicle as expected, his fiancée raised the alarm, initiating a search that began with the grim discovery of his car parked exactly where he had left it. The vehicle sat silent in the heat, an empty vessel in the middle of a vast, indifferent basin. The search teams that arrived the next morning were faced with a daunting geography. They were not looking for someone who had wandered off a trail. They were looking for someone who had intentionally chosen an off-trail route that required thousands of feet of climbing over unstable, crumbling stone. The searchers moved quickly, knowing that in the July heat, time was not merely a factor, it was the entire equation. By the 17th of July, only 24 hours after he had been reported overdue, An aerial unit spotted his backpack lying in the open, approximately 8/10 of a mile from where he had parked his car. It was a small, singular point in a landscape of millions, a testament to the effectiveness of modern search techniques. But for the person they were looking for, it was a profound sign of distress. Not long after finding the pack, the ground teams located Peter Rhoad himself, lying roughly 2,500 feet further along his intended route. The investigation that followed by the Inyo County Deputy Coroner was swift and definitive, grounded in the cold facts of the terrain. He had suffered a significant fall on the loose, unforgiving scree of the mountain. A single slip on a shifting rock had resulted in a fatal skull fracture. This was the immediate cause of his death, but the desert had compounded the tragedy with its own implacable cruelty. The high temperatures of that afternoon meant that even had he survived the initial impact, the heat exposure alone would have claimed him in a matter of hours. There is a profound, chilling simplicity in this case that forces one to reconsider the nature of wilderness safety. Peter Rhoad was not lost in the sense that we often imagine. He did not wander aimlessly for days in the wrong direction. He did not lack supplies, and he was not caught unprepared by a sudden freak storm. He was, by all accounts, exactly where he intended to be, executing a plan he had researched and prepared for. He died within a mile of his own vehicle, in a landscape that he clearly respected. Yet the terrain itself remained fundamentally hostile to human error. A single misplaced foot on a loose patch of stone was enough to end a life before the authorities even realized he was missing. It serves as a reminder that in the Panamint Range, the desert does not need to hide you to claim you. It only needs 1 second of instability and 1 afternoon of relentless, crushing heat to turn a standard hiking objective into a final destination. There is no malice in the rock, and there is no intent in the sun. There is only the fact that the mountains have existed for millions of years, and the human frame is, in comparison, fragile and brief. The recovery of his remains provided a closure that is tragically rare in the desert, where many who fall are simply swallowed by the scale of the earth. But while Peter Rhoad was found because he happened to fall in the open, his story highlights the terrifying proximity of death to the trailhead. It is a sobering thought to carry as we move away from the Panamint and into the deepest, most isolated heart of the Red Rock country. There is one district located within the vast, intricate network of canyons in Utah, so remote and so trackless that the National Park Service itself designates it as the most inaccessible place it manages. It is a region where the maps are frequently wrong, where the terrain is a chaotic vertical maze of stone fins and deep lightless slots, and where the first, and often only, sign of trouble is an empty vehicle left waiting in the dirt, its engine cold, its driver gone into a silence that has never been broken. The Maze District of Canyonlands National Park is a place that defies the conventional geometry of the American wilderness. Located in the fractured, high desert heart of southern Utah, this is not merely a collection of canyons. It is an erosional masterpiece of such complexity and scale that the National Park Service maintains a standing policy of warning visitors that they must be entirely self-sufficient for 3 days or more before they even consider entering. To arrive at the edge of the maze is to leave the known geography of the West behind. It is a labyrinth of slick rock, sandstone spires, and deep, serpentine washes, a region so remote and so stubbornly devoid of infrastructure that the very idea of a trail becomes a relative suggestion. There are no visitor centers here, no marked loops or paved pull-offs. There is only the Hans Flat Ranger Station, a lonely outpost that serves as the last point of contact before the road disintegrates into the Flint Trail, a harrowing, narrow shelf road that clings to the cliffside like a thread of grit. Beyond that point, the world transforms into the land of standing rocks and the dollhouse, a vast orange and gold puzzle of stone that looks, from the air, like the broken fragments of a shattered planet. In a landscape this intricate, the primary danger is not a single, definable event. It is the terrain itself. The maze is a place of infinite repetition. Every drainage looks identical to the one that preceded it. Every sandstone fin is a mirror of the next. To step away from a vehicle here is to enter a world where the horizon is perpetually hidden behind a screen of rock, and where a mistake of a few hundred yards can lead a person into a cul-de-sac of canyon walls from which there is no obvious exit. It is a place that tests the human capacity for navigation, and it is a place that has, on more than one occasion, proved that distance in the desert is not merely a measure of miles, but a measure of time and endurance. The park is a vast, silent machine of wind and water, and it does not require a storm or a catastrophe to claim a life. It requires only the quiet, unrelenting passage of the sun and the indifference of the stone. On the morning of April 24th, 2023, the silence of the Maze district was broken by the discovery of an unoccupied vehicle parked deep in the backcountry. The find was reported to the rangers at Hans Flat, and it triggered a protocol that is as familiar as it is chilling. The search for the person who had left the vehicle behind. In this country, an empty car is a silent witness, a relic of a journey that was meant to be a return trip. It signifies a person who stepped out into the labyrinth, perhaps to photograph the light shifting against the hoodoos, perhaps to scout a route, or perhaps simply to stand in the stillness of the red rock. When the search and rescue teams began their work, they were operating in a landscape that actively resists discovery. The terrain is so rugged and the canyons so deep that air support is often the only way to cover the ground, and even then, the shadows cast by the high walls can hide a human form as effectively as a veil. The man who had parked the vehicle was a 48-year-old from Nederland, Colorado. He was a person who had come to this remote corner of the earth seeking the solitude that only the maze can provide. The official response involved a coordinated effort between the National Park Service and the Wayne County Sheriff's Office, with a Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter crew providing the necessary reach to survey the inaccessible drainages. After the searchers combed through the surrounding backcountry, they located him. There was no public statement regarding the final cause of his death, nor was his name released to the media, leaving the circumstances of his final hours as silent as the stone that surrounded him. In the wake of such an event, there is a profound, lingering sense of the desert's capability to absorb a human life without leaving a trace of its passage. The maze does not offer up its secrets. It simply holds them, buried in the sand and the shadow of the cliffs, a testament to the fact that in the most remote district of the American park system, the margin for error is non-existent. What remains, for those who come after, is the weight of the silence. To stand in the dollhouse amidst the towering, wind-sculpted stone is to be reminded of how small and fragile a human presence is against the timescale of the canyon. The maze is a place that demands a total submission to its own terms, and it is a place where the landscape remains entirely unchanged by the people who walk through it. It is a territory of absolute solitude, where the wind is the only thing that moves with purpose, and where the sun dictates the rhythm of every living thing. The man from Nederland became a part of that rhythm, a brief, fleeting movement in a canyon that has seen millions of years of erosion and will see millions more. His presence was recorded by the empty vehicle left in the dust, a temporary monument to a life that had reached its end in a place where the world seems to have stopped turning. There is a specific cold gravity to the way the maze functions as a trap. It does not lure its victims with the promise of adventure, so much as it presents an environment of such profound, hypnotic beauty that a person can be drawn deeper and deeper into its folds without ever realizing they have crossed the threshold of survival. It is a slow, methodical erasure. The heat acts upon the body, the distance acts upon the mind, and the repetition of the landscape acts upon the sense of direction until there is no longer a path back to the beginning. The searchers who find the missing are often left with more questions than answers, as the desert rarely leaves a narrative behind. It leaves only the facts of the location, the recovery, and the void where a person once stood. This is the central unsettling truth of the maze. It is a place where a man can be surrounded by the most spectacular geography on Earth and yet be utterly, completely alone. It is a landscape that requires a level of vigilance that few possess and that even fewer can maintain. For in the heat and the glare of the Utah sun, the mind begins to wander and the red rock begins to close in. The maze kills with distance and stone, stripping away the ability to plan, to navigate, and to survive, until all that remains is the vast, indifferent desert. But the same red rock country hides a faster, more violent killer, one that needs no labyrinth, only a narrow slot, a distant storm you cannot see, and a wall of water that arrives without warning. In the deep, vertical heart of southern Utah, the earth does not merely erode, it fractures. Zion National Park is defined by this radical geography, a landscape of Navajo sandstone carved by the relentless, patient passage of the Virgin River into narrow, towering fissures that seem to defy the very physics of the desert. To walk through the Narrows is to walk along the floor of a cathedral whose roof is a ribbon of sky 1,000 feet above your head. It is a place of profound, echoing silence, where the light is filtered into a bruised golden twilight, and the air feels perpetually cool, dampened by the river that forms the only path forward. But this verticality, which draws thousands of visitors to marvel at the sheer scale of the rock, is also the geography of the desert's most abrupt and terrifying transition. In the slot canyons, the desert does not kill with the slow, creeping dehydration of the open scrub. It kills with the sudden, violent arrival of water that has fallen miles away, under a sky that remains perfectly, deceptively blue. On the 19th of August, 2022, the risk that every experienced canyoneer knows by heart crystallized into a tragedy that played out in the space of a single afternoon. Jatal Agnihotri, a 29-year-old from Tucson, Arizona, had entered the Narrows with a group, seeking the particular solitude that only the deepest parts of the canyon can offer. As the day progressed, weather patterns in the high country above the drainage began to shift, dropping less than an inch of rain over the surrounding plateaus. In the open desert, such a storm might be little more than a brief cooling spell, a welcome break from the heat. But in a slot canyon, that volume of water is collected by the narrow, rock-hewn funnels of the tributary system and concentrated into a single, unstoppable force. When the flood arrived near the temple of Sinawava, it did not arrive as a rising tide, but as a wall of debris, dark with silt and timber, moving with a speed that left no room for retreat. While others in the vicinity were able to reach higher ground, Agnihotri was swept away by the surge. What followed was a massive, days-long mobilization of search and rescue teams, a desperate scouring of the riverbanks and the boulder-choked bends of the Narrows. It was not until the 22nd of August, 3 days after the deluge, that her body was recovered near the court of the patriarchs, nearly 6 miles downstream from where she had been standing when the water struck. The sheer scale of the search, involving more than 170 responders, underlined the reality that in Zion, the river is both the trail and the grave, a conveyor of immense force that can pull a person from the relative safety of a canyon floor and carry them into the dark, hidden recesses of the downstream wilderness. The tragedy of the Narrows is a recurring, brutal reminder that in a slot canyon, you are entirely beholden to the weather you cannot see. Yet, even that terror is eclipsed by the events that unfolded 7 years earlier in Keyhole Canyon, a narrow, serpentine slot of rock that remains etched in the history of American mountaineering as the deadliest single canyoneering incident on record. On the 14th of September 2015, a group of 7 people entered Keyhole Canyon, intending to navigate its rappels and chambers in a day. They were experienced, prepared, and familiar with the risks inherent to the sport. But just as they reached the deeper sections of the slot, a localized heavy storm hit the region, dumping over half an inch of rain in less than an hour. The flash flood that resulted was instantaneous and catastrophic. The members of the group, Gary Favela, Don Teichner, Muku Reynolds, Steve and Linda Arthur, Robin Brum, and Mark McKenzie, were caught in a section of the canyon where the walls were vertical and unforgiving, offering absolutely no escape. There was no time to climb, no ledge to reach, and no warning that would have allowed them to reach higher ground. The force of the water, laden with the weight of the debris it had gathered from the plateaus above, moved through the slot with a speed that turned the stone passage into a centrifuge of destruction. The recovery effort that followed was a harrowing, multi-day operation as teams navigated the dangerous, unstable terrain to locate the victims. By the time the last of them were retrieved from the silt and the rock, the tragedy had sent shockwaves through the entire outdoor community. It remains a stark, sober lesson in the limitations of human preparation. Even with the best gear, the best training, and the most careful planning, the desert slot canyons can close their doors in a matter of seconds, transforming a playground of stone into a trap that provides no second chance. These tragedies unsettle because they reveal the fragility of our movement through the desert. We treat the national parks as managed spaces, as places where the trails are marked and the risks are mitigated by signs and weather reports. But in the deep canyons, nature operates on a scale that ignores our presence entirely. The flash flood is not malicious. It is simply the desert's way of clearing its throat, of moving the sediment and the water that must travel toward the low ground. To be in the wrong place at the wrong time is not a failure of judgment, but a collision with a force that has been carving these canyons for millions of years. It is a reminder that the desert is not a static landscape, but a dynamic, moving, and often lethal environment that demands a degree of humility we are often too arrogant to provide. When the water recedes, the slot canyons of Zion return to a state of eerie, pristine beauty. The sunlit walls glow with the same rich, burnt orange. The river trickles quietly over the smooth stones, and the paths appear as inviting and serene as they were before the flood. It is a cruel deception, a mask of stability that hides the violent history of the rock. Yet even in the canyons, the ground eventually settles. The river carries its burden to the valley floor, and the evidence of the catastrophe is gradually smoothed away by the wind and the next high water event. Water fills a slot canyon in seconds and then drains away, leaving the rock dry and innocent again. But some desert ground swallows a person and simply closes over the top, so that they lie a few feet beneath the living and are not found for weeks, as a family in the California Badlands would learn, listening for a voice they could not hear. The Anza-Borrego Desert sits in the rain shadow of the Peninsula Ranges in Southern California, a vast, scorched expanse of over 600,000 acres that feels less like a state park and more like the floor of a dried-up ocean. It is a world of serrated ridges, ancient lake beds, and the Carrizo Badlands, a landscape so aggressively eroded that it seems to be in a constant slow-motion state of collapse. Among its most disorienting features are the mud caves of Arroyo Tapiado. These are not caves in the traditional sense, carved by water over geological epochs into solid limestone or granite. They are ephemeral, crumbling catacombs cut into soft claystone and alluvial fans by the violent periodic flash flooding that defines this climate. They are tunnels of hardened mud, fragile and labyrinthine, riddled with skylights, blind alleys, and hidden vertical fissures that drop into the darkness with no warning. To walk through the Arroyo Tapiado is to walk across a ceiling of Swiss cheese, where the ground beneath your boots might be a solid path one moment and a gaping hidden void the next. It was into this fragile, shifting terrain that Guillermo Pino Jr., known to his friends and family as Willie, ventured on Easter Sunday, April 8, 2012. He was 24 years old, a student of psychology at UC San Diego, and he possessed the curiosity and the comfort with the outdoors that often defines the young. He had traveled to the Badlands with a group of friends and family, seeking the stark, surreal beauty that only the high desert can offer. The day was typical for early April, a relentless, dry heat that radiated off the pale clay walls of the canyons, driving the group to seek the shade of the caves for relief. It was a mundane moment, the kind that happens thousands of times a day in the wilderness. The group ducked into a tunnel to escape the sun, and Willie remained behind, sitting on a ledge of mud above the cave entrance to watch, perhaps to wait, or simply to enjoy the view of the canyon. When his companions emerged from the subterranean cool a short time later, they expected to see him exactly where they had left him. Instead, the ledge was empty. There was no sound, no sign of a struggle, and no trail of footprints to follow. The desert floor here is hard-packed and unforgiving, and within the narrow confines of the canyon, the echoes of the wind can make a person feel as though they are standing in an empty cathedral. At first, the confusion was manageable. A person who vanishes in a canyon is usually just around the next bend. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and the afternoon light began to sharpen the shadows of the Badlands into long, jagged fingers, the situation transformed from a simple separation into a profound and terrifying mystery. The search that followed was immediate, involving local authorities and specialized search and rescue teams who spent the better part of a week combing the canyons. They scanned the ridges, walked the wash, and peered into the entrances of the known mud caves. They found nothing. There was no gear discarded, no water bottle dropped, no note written in the dirt. The desert had simply, efficiently, swallowed a man in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. As the days turned into weeks, the official agencies eventually suspended their active search, citing the lack of evidence and the sheer, impossible scale of the terrain. But his family did not stop. They understood, perhaps better than the professional searchers, that the desert does not always discard what it takes. Sometimes, it merely hides it in plain sight. They returned to the site again and again, refusing to accept the silence of the canyons. They eventually hired a private investigator, and on May 5th, nearly 4 weeks after he had last been seen sitting on that sun-baked ledge, they decided to focus their attention on the one thing the authorities had overlooked: the ground itself. Using a small, specialized video camera, they began to lower the device into the fissures and narrow openings that pockmarked the surface of the canyon rim, peering into the dark, vertical cracks that were too tight for a human to climb into. It was a desperate, methodical process of elimination, moving from one opening to the next, until the screen flickered with the image of a body pinned 60 feet below the surface. The medical examiner's report would later conclude that Willie had died of asphyxiation and suffocation. He had fallen into a narrow, hidden fissure near the ledge where he was sitting, a trap that was invisible from the surface and nearly impossible to detect. He was pinned in a position that made breathing an impossibility, partially covered by the very debris that makes these mud caves so unstable. He had been there the entire time, just a few yards from the searchers who had walked over the top of his grave, their voices likely echoing down into the crevice while he was trapped in the dark. It was a tragedy of geography, a reminder of how the desert's surface is often a thin, brittle mask over a deeper, more dangerous reality. The recovery of his body provided the only kind of closure that families in these situations ever receive. but it left behind an indelible mark on the landscape of the Badlands. It serves as a stark testament to the fact that, in the desert, danger is not always found in the wide-open spaces where you expect to be tested. Sometimes, it is located precisely where you believe you are safest, sitting on a ledge of mud, watching the world go by. The Badlands hid Willie Pino a few feet beneath the people who loved him, turning a family gathering into a month-long nightmare of silence and searching. But the desert can also hide a person in plain sight, in the most photographed hole on the planet, where cars sit abandoned at the rim, and a myth has grown up around a number that isn't true. The Grand Canyon is not a single place, but a vast, discordant kingdom of stone that forces the human scale to collapse. To stand at the edge of the South Rim is to look upon 2 billion years of geology exposed in a mile-deep gash, a landscape so layered and shattered that the eye cannot find a place to rest. Every year, nearly 5 million people come to the edge of this abyss. They walk the paved paths of the South Rim. They peer through binoculars at the distant, shimmering ribbon of the Colorado River, and they leave their photos on social media as evidence of a successful, if dizzying, pilgrimage. Given the sheer density of these crowds, and the immediate lethality of the terrain, it is perhaps inevitable that the Grand Canyon generates more missing person reports than any other wilderness area in the United States. It is a number that has been distorted and mythologized by internet lore for years. You will find recurring, unsubstantiated claims that hundreds or even thousands of people have vanished into the canyon's depths, never to be seen again. This narrative is a fabrication, a phantom statistic birthed in the pages of sensationalist fringe literature that ignores the reality of the park's own reporting. The truth is far more mundane. The vast majority of those thousands of missing person reports are resolved within hours or days. They are hikers who took a wrong turn at a junction, tourists who wandered too far from their group, or people who simply failed to check in at the time they intended. They are found, they are guided back to the trail, and they go home. The Grand Canyon is not a vortex of the supernatural. It is a place of extreme heat, punishing verticality, and a labyrinthine topography that can turn a simple day hike into a fatal error in minutes. Yet, when you strip away the urban legends and the inflated figures, the truth that remains is arguably more chilling. Because in the rare documented cases where the mountain does not give back the person who walked into it, the silence that follows is absolute. There is no mystery of a shifting supernatural landscape. There is only the terrifying physical reality of the canyon scale. It is a place that can swallow a person whole, not because it is haunted, but because it is simply too big to search. Consider the case of Floyd E. Roberts III. In June of 2016, the 52-year-old was traversing the remote Shivwits Plateau, a sprawling high-altitude section of the canyon's western reaches that sees few visitors and even fewer search teams. He was part of a hiking party, an experienced group moving through a landscape of scrub, juniper, and hidden treacherous drainages. On the 17th of June, near a landmark known as Kelly Tank, the group became separated. It was not a grand, dramatic event. It was a momentary lapse, a decision to contour across a slope, while others took a different line toward the vicinity of 214 Mile Canyon. When he failed to rendezvous with the others, the alarm was raised, and for 6 days, the National Park Service launched an intensive, multi-agency effort. They deployed ground teams, specialized search dogs, and aerial assets to scan the narrow, twisting side canyons and the brush-choked plateaus. They looked for tracks, for discarded gear, for anything that might suggest a direction. They found nothing. Not a canteen, not a scrap of clothing, not a single footprint in the dust. The search eventually scaled down, as it must when the terrain is so vast, and the window for survival in the summer heat has long since closed. To this day, the case remains an open, unsolved file in the National Park Service's Investigative Services branch. The canyon does not always wait for a group to break apart. Sometimes it takes a person who is entirely alone, someone who leaves their life behind on the rim and simply walks into the stone. Jonghyun Won, a 45-year-old from Los Angeles, arrived at the park in September of 2017. His vehicle, a white Toyota Camry, was discovered abandoned at Moran Point, a popular overlook on the South Rim. Investigators later placed him in the vicinity of the New Hants trailhead, a rugged and often unmaintained route that drops thousands of feet from the rim down to the inner gorge. It is a path that demands significant preparation and an intimate knowledge of the heat-stressed environment. When Juan failed to return to his vehicle, the ensuing search covered miles of the inner canyon's rugged Tonto platform and the steep, boulder-strewn slopes of the descent. Like Roberts, he vanished into the geological record. Despite the concentrated efforts of park rangers and the high visibility of the rim, no trace of him was ever recovered. He is one of the few names on the park's cold case list, a person whose final movements exist only as a series of unanswered questions tethered to a car left idling in the sun. These are not stories of people who stumbled into a hidden world. They are stories of people who walked into a landscape they understood, in a place that is documented and mapped, and found that the canyon's indifference is a physical force. In the Grand Canyon, the distance between safety and the end of one's life can be measured in a single wrong step off a trail or a 10-minute deviation into a side canyon that leads to a dead-end drop. The searchers often talk about the needle in the haystack. But the Grand Canyon is not a haystack. It is a billion needles, all of them sharp, all of them identical, and all of them capable of hiding a human life beneath the weight of deep time. When you look at the records of the vanished, you realize that the canyon's real ledger is short and honest and cold. It does not possess a desire to keep the people it takes. It simply lacks the capacity to relinquish them once they have fallen into the creases of its immense, sun-baked folds. But the desert's strangest disappearance did not happen in a national park at all. It happened on a lonely stretch of Nevada wildlife refuge, on camera, to a man who told the internet exactly where he was going, and then walked past the last place anyone could follow. The sheep range in southern Nevada exists as a paradox of proximity. From the northern outskirts of Las Vegas, the mountains rise like a serrated wall of limestone and desert varnish, a rugged high-altitude spine that separates the suburban expansion of the city from the vast, closed-off mysteries of the Nellis Air Force Range. It is the heart of the Desert National Wildlife Refuge, the largest such refuge in the lower 48 states, a landscape that shifts from the low-slung, creosote-dusted basins of the Mojave to the pinyon juniper forests of the high ridges. It is a place of profound solitude, where the silence is broken only by the occasional sonic boom of military aircraft testing the limits of the sky above, and where the geography is scarred by the remnants of old mining ventures, vertical shafts, rusted steel, and forgotten tracks that lead to nowhere. In November of 2014, Kenneth Veach, a 47-year-old Las Vegas resident and a man who considered himself a seasoned desert hiker, walked into this range with the intention of testing his limits. Veach was a familiar face in the niche online communities that obsess over the desert's hidden corners. He operated a YouTube channel under the handle Snake Bit McGee, where he documented his solo treks through the most inhospitable scrubland in the West. He was not a novice. He understood the math of the desert, water consumption, temperature shifts, the necessity of navigation. On November 10th, he parked his white Honda CR-V at the Jomay Canyon trailhead, told his girlfriend he was setting out for a short 2-day excursion, and stepped off the gravel toward the rugged, limestone-walled drainage of Corkscrew Canyon. He did not return. When the days passed and the silence from the mountains grew too long to ignore, the search began. It was a massive, multi-agency effort that drew in the expertise of Red Rock Search and Rescue, local sheriff's deputies, and specialized teams capable of navigating the verticality of the Sheep Range. For over a week, the air was filled with the rhythmic beat of helicopter rotors, and the canyons were scoured by dozens of searchers who looked for a sign, a footprint, a discarded wrapper, a scrap of gear. They found his vehicle exactly where he had left it, sitting in the dust, as if its owner might emerge at any moment. They tracked his probable path deep into the canyon country, tracing his likely route toward the jagged, light-starved apertures of old, abandoned mine shafts. On November 22nd, 12 days after he had entered the desert, they found his cell phone lying in the dirt near the opening of one of those shafts. That phone is the final anchor point in the story of Kenneth Veach. Beyond that point, the trail simply evaporated. Dave Cummings, the incident commander for the search, would later confirm the grim, clinical reality of the situation. Searchers had followed the trail to a deep, dangerous vertical mine shaft in a remote sector of the canyon, and there, the evidence stopped. There was no sign that he had entered the shaft, nor was there any sign of a struggle, an accident, or a path forward. The desert had simply absorbed him. Despite the intensity of the search and the weeks spent combing the surrounding ridges, the desert gave nothing back. No body was ever recovered. No trace of his existence beyond that single device was ever found. He remains, on the official ledgers, as a man who walked into the wilderness and ceased to be. In the years since, the story of Kenny Veach has been heavily encrusted with layers of internet mythology that often threaten to obscure the cold, verified facts of his disappearance. Much of the discourse surrounding his case centers on a claim he made in a comment on one of his own videos earlier in 2014. Veach had suggested that during a previous undocumented hike, he had stumbled upon a mysterious cave entrance shaped like the letter M somewhere near the boundary of the military range, and that as he neared the opening, his body began to vibrate with an unexplained physical intensity. He claimed he retreated in fear. In the months that followed, he made follow-up videos expressing a desire to return to that location to prove his claim. And it was widely speculated by his followers that this second, fatal trip was motivated by a desire to find the source of that alleged phenomenon. It is necessary, however, to distinguish between the man and the legend. The M cave, the supposed vibration of his body, and the frequent, tenuous attempts to link his disappearance to the nearby, highly classified government installations are, by all verifiable evidence, nothing more than claims and later internet embellishments. There is no evidence that such a cave exists, and there is no evidence that his disappearance was anything other than a tragic, solitary death in a harsh environment. The reality of the Sheep Range is frightening enough without the need for fiction. It is a place of dizzying verticality and sudden disorienting topography, where a person can be standing in the sun one moment, and through a single misstep, or a turn into the wrong drainage, be trapped in a labyrinth of rock where no cell signal can penetrate and no rescue team can easily reach. The mystery of Kenneth Veach is not one of shadows or clandestine activity. It is a mystery of scale. It is the mystery of how a man, experienced and equipped, can be effectively erased from a landscape that, while rugged, is not infinite. His disappearance serves as a haunting testament to the desert's ability to act as a silent, efficient void. When a search ends without a recovery, the desert wins by default. It keeps the secrets of the final hours, the decisions made in the heat of the afternoon, and the precise moment of physical failure. The desert does not require a dramatic catalyst to claim a life. It requires only an absence of witness. In the end, the search for Kenny Veach proved only that the desert is capable of hiding what it takes with total, indifferent success. The mine shafts of the Sheep Range remain, dark and jagged, still holding the potential for hidden dangers that searchers can rarely fully account for. The terrain itself, with its limestone crags and relentless sun-baked washes, remains the same as it was on that November morning in 2014. The silence of the refuge is heavy, and it is a silence that offers no comfort to those who still look for an explanation that the land is not prepared to provide. Strip away the ghost stories, and Kenny Veach is simply gone, like so many before him, into ordinary desert that asks no questions and keeps no records. But the longest silences are sometimes the ones that finally break, as they did for a man whose car sat at a Joshua Tree trailhead for a single summer, and whose bones waited 12 years to be found. Joshua Tree National Park sits at a strange and high-altitude intersection where the Mojave Desert meets the Colorado, a 2,000-square-mile expanse of twisted rock, Monza granite boulders, and the iconic spindly-limbed trees that give the park its name. To the casual visitor, the landscape is a surreal, almost playful gallery of stone, but the terrain is notoriously deceptive. It is a place of endless, rolling ridges that look exactly like the ones you just crossed. And when the midday sun hits the granite, it bleaches the entire horizon into a uniform, shimmering haze that can disorient even a veteran outdoorsman. The park's northwestern sector, encompassing the Juniper Flats trailhead and the steep, rugged slopes of Quail Mountain, is among the most challenging to navigate. It is a labyrinth of box canyons, sudden drops, and dense stands of scrub that swallow sound and direction alike, leaving a hiker with nothing but the heat, the glare, and the crushing realization that every direction looks identical to the last. On June 24, 2010, William Iwasco, a 66-year-old retired electrical engineer from Georgia, arrived at the Juniper Flats trailhead. He was a seasoned hiker who had spent years traversing trails across the American West, a man who possessed the technical knowledge and the experience to understand the risks of solo desert travel. He wore appropriate gear, carried a pack, and set out with the intention of completing a loop through the high country. When he did not return to his rental car, a white Chrysler Sebring parked at the trailhead. The silence that followed became one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of the National Park Service. When the alarm was raised 2 days later, the response was immediate and massive. For 11 days, a small army of searchers combed the high desert scrub. They brought in helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras. They deployed ground teams on horseback, and they utilized specialized search dogs to track any potential movement through the brush. They scrutinized the rugged terrain of Smith Water Canyon and the steep ascents leading toward the summit of Quail Mountain. They followed every possible lead, analyzed every scrap of information, and searched the sectors where a person in distress would logically attempt to seek shelter or find a way back to a road. And then, as the 11th day concluded, the formal search was called off. The desert had simply absorbed the trace of the man who walked into it. In the years that followed, the disappearance of Bill Iwasco became something of a touchstone for the search and rescue community. It was not a forgotten case, but rather a persistent puzzle that refused to be solved. An amateur investigator and retired engineer began a meticulous, years-long analysis of the search data, publishing dozens of detailed reports that attempted to triangulate Iwasco's potential path based on the last known ping from his cell phone. It was an exhaustive, intellectual labor, a way of trying to beat the desert's indifference with logic and mathematics. For 12 years, those who knew his story looked at the maps, studied the terrain, and wondered how a man could simply vanish from a landscape that, while large, was not infinite. The answer, when it finally arrived, came not from a calculated search grid, but from the simple, brutal reality of the desert's scale. On February 8, 2022, nearly a dozen years after he was last seen, hikers exploring a remote, steep ravine near the Panorama Loop, roughly 10 miles from where the white Chrysler Sebring had been abandoned, discovered the remains of a man. With the remains were a backpack and a wallet confirming his identity. He had been found in a sector of the park that had been identified as a high-probability area by analysts. Yet the terrain was so rugged, so dense with boulders and brush, that he had remained hidden from every aerial sweep and every ground team that had walked within a few hundred yards of him. The official recovery did not provide the closure that many had hoped for. The cause of his death remained undetermined, though the consensus among those who monitored the case was that he had become disoriented, attempted to navigate through the brutal terrain of the northwestern wilderness, and eventually succumbed to the elements. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of a struggle, no grand explanation. There was only the fact of his presence in a place he should not have been, 10 miles from his car, in an area that proved to be a graveyard for his intentions. The desert had held him in its grip for over a decade, shielding him from the searchers who spent years looking for him, only to reveal him to the chance passerby long after the search had transitioned into a memory. There is a profound, quiet horror in realizing that a man can be lost in plain sight, that the landscape can hide a person for 12 years through nothing more than a few thousand feet of granite and the slow, scrubby growth of the Mojave. It forces one to confront the reality that the desert does not hate. It merely exists, and in its existence, it is capable of erasing a human life with a terrifying, absolute efficiency. When the park finally gave him back, it offered no narrative, no final message, and no resolution other than the location of his bones. It left the world with the same questions that had been asked in 2010. How he arrived at that specific hidden ravine, and what the final hours of that journey looked like beneath the relentless sun of the high desert. 12 years is a long time for the desert to hold its silence. But there is one case that has held its silence for nearly a century. A 20-year-old who walked into the canyons of Utah with 2 burros and a sketchbook, left behind a single carved word, and became the most haunting vanishing the American desert has ever recorded but one. In the vast folded wilderness of southern Utah, where the Escalante River carves its way toward the Colorado, there exists a landscape so intricate that it seems designed to defy the mapmaker. This is the country of the high plateaus and the slick rock depths, a place of sheer-walled canyons, hidden arches, and side gulches that wind away into the red silence for miles, ending often in impossible vertical drops or sudden narrow slot canyons where the light never reaches the floor. Today, this land is protected as the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, but in the autumn of 1934, it was far more remote, a frontier of stone and wind that felt, to the few who knew it, like the final unmapped edge of the American West. It is a land of beautiful, treacherous geology, where a wanderer can pass within a few hundred yards of a hidden spring and never know it was there, and where the scale of the erosion is so grand that a human being is reduced to the size of a single falling leaf. Into this country in the mid-1930s came a young man named Everett Roos. He was only 20 years old, an artist and a poet from California who had spent the better part of his late adolescence drifting through the Southwest alone, carrying little more than his pack, his journals, his block printing tools, and a quiet, persistent hunger for the solitude of the desert. He was not a tourist. He wrote of the canyons with a reverence that bordered on the religious, and his letters home spoke of a soul drawn to the absolute isolation of the high desert. By November of 1934, Roos had arrived in the small, isolated village of Escalante, a tiny outpost of civilization on the edge of the Great Canyon Labyrinth. On the 20th of that month, he left the village behind. He had with him 2 burros to carry his supplies, and he turned his back on the last known path, heading down the rough, historic route known as the Hole in the Rock. He told those he met that he intended to head down toward the Escalante River and then into the canyons beyond, a region that even then was considered trackless and daunting. He was never seen alive again. When the weeks turned into months and the letters from the young wanderer stopped coming, an alarm was raised that eventually reached far beyond the small town of Escalante. In March of 1935, a search party set out into the deep, winding gullies of the canyon country, looking for the boy who had walked into the desert with his 2 burros. They did not find him, but they did find the evidence of his final days. In Davis Gulch, a side canyon of the Escalante, they discovered the 2 burros, alive and penned in a hand-built corral of brush and stone. His campsite was there as well, the traces of his fire still visible, his saddlebags and gear left behind, but there was no sign of Roos himself. Nearby, carved into the smooth red sandstone wall of the canyon, was a short, cryptic inscription, Nemo 1934. The name was a heavy choice for a 20-year-old poet. Nemo, the Latin word for no one, was the alias used by Odysseus to outwit the Cyclops, and it was the name Captain Nemo gave himself in the literature of the sea, the man who renounced the world to live beneath the waves. To find the name carved into the canyon wall, miles from any human habitation, felt like a message, or perhaps a declaration. But the searchers, despite their efforts, which included teams of horsemen scouring the gulches, and by the standards of the day, a surprisingly thorough aerial survey, found absolutely nothing else. There was no body, no sign of an accident, and no indication that he had ever left the vicinity of his camp. His journals, his art, and the rest of his life simply vanished. The desert had taken the man, but it had left the mystery of his final carved word, and for 75 years, that was the only story the canyons would tell. The silence of the case was broken only once, and in a way that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. In 2009, news broke that human remains discovered in a crevice on Combe Ridge had been identified through DNA analysis as those of Everett Ruiz. The news was celebrated by his remaining family and by the thousands who had been captivated by his legend over the decades. It seemed at last that the desert had surrendered its most famous lost son. But within months, the story unraveled. A reanalysis of the genetic evidence, conducted with more rigorous standards, revealed that the remains belonged to a Native American person who had lived centuries before. The original match had been a laboratory error, a false hope born of the desire to give a name to a ghost. The identification was retracted, the mystery was restored, and Everett Ruiz remained, as he had been since 1934, a figure who had walked into the deep red stone and been erased by the scale of the land. There is a profound, lingering discomfort in the realization that a person can be so utterly removed from the earth. The searchers who looked for Ruiz were men who understood the land. They knew the water sources, the hidden paths, and the way the shadows fell in the canyons. They knew that the desert does not need to conspire to destroy a person. It only needs to be itself. It is a place of such profound indifference that a death can occur within a few hundred yards of a trail and yet remain undiscovered for a century. The fact that the searchers found his burrows, his companions, his lifeline, penned in that small corral, but could not find the man who had built it, suggests a finality that defies easy explanation. Did he wander away to see what lay around the next bend? Did he succumb to a fall in a place where the rock is too steep for a body to be seen? We do not know. We only know the silence of the canyon floor and the name he left behind on the stone, as if he had prepared his own vanishing. Everett Ruiz signed himself No One and became exactly that. His is the desert's most poetic disappearance, but it is not its cruelest. For that, we go to the hottest place on earth and to a family of 4 who left their stranded van and walked out into the heat together, and of whom the desert, after 13 years, would give back only half. Death Valley is not merely a place, it is a condition of the earth. In the remote southern reaches of this vast basin, where the Panamint Range buckles into a chaotic architecture of sun-bleached rock and sudden vertical drops, the landscape sheds the veneer of a park and reverts to something prehistoric. This is the country of Anvil Spring Canyon and the high, lonely reaches of the Butte Valley, a place of silent, salt-crusted washes and dirt tracks that do not so much lead anywhere as they do simply vanish against the chain-link fences of the China Lake Naval Installation. In the height of a July summer, the surface temperatures here routinely push past 120 degrees. The air is so thin and dry that it feels abrasive against the skin. It is a landscape that operates with a terrifyingly clean indifference to the human biology that attempts to traverse it. Here, in the absolute silence of the Panamint backcountry, the desert does not just hide a person. It erases them. On the 23rd of July, 1996, 4 people, Egbert Rimkus, a 34-year-old man from Dresden, Germany, his girlfriend, 27-year-old Cornelia Meyer, and their 2 young sons, 11-year-old Georg Weber and 4-year-old Max Meyer, drove a rented green Plymouth Voyager van into this lethal furnace. They were tourists, part of a family group on a summer holiday, and the paper trail of their transit is precise. A receipt here, a sighting there, a plan to explore the southern reaches of the park before moving on. But they never moved on. They drove into the rugged, mountainous expanse of the southern range and quite simply dropped out of the known world. When they failed to appear at their next destination, the search that followed became one of the most exhaustive in the history of the National Park Service. Helicopters scoured the ridges, ground teams picked through the heat-shimmering canyons, and the flyers were posted across the region. But the desert was, at that time, a perfect vault. It was not until October of 1996, 3 months after the family had last been seen, that a ranger spotted the green van abandoned in the mouth of Anvil Spring Canyon near Willow Spring. The vehicle was found with 3 flat tires, stalled in a landscape that offered no shelter from the relentless, soul-crushing heat. The doors were unlocked, the contents were intact. But of the 4 people who had driven it into the canyon, there was no trace, no tracks, no gear discarded in a panic, no note left behind. The search teams doubled their efforts, moving outward from the van in concentric circles that covered miles of the harshest terrain in North America. They found nothing. As the seasons turned and the heat of the summer gave way to the sharp, freezing winds of winter, the search was eventually scaled back and then halted altogether. The Death Valley Germans, as they would come to be called in the grim shorthand of the park's records, became a cold case, a permanent, open wound in the park's history. For 13 years, the desert held them. 13 years of wind, of flash floods that rearranged the gravel of the canyon floors, and of a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the very memory of the family. The mystery might have ended there, as so many others have, if not for the work of an amateur investigator named Tom Mahood. A retired civil engineer and former search and rescue volunteer, Mahood spent years meticulously reconstructing the family's probable route, applying a cold, analytical mind to the geography of the Panamint Range. He analyzed the terrain, the likely survival strategies of a stranded party, and the subtle, often ignored logic of the landscape itself. On the 12th of November, 2009, those years of study reached a conclusion that was both a resolution and a tragedy. Following the path he had projected, Mahood and his partner, Les Walker, found skeletal remains in a remote, rugged drainage miles away from where the van had been recovered. Over the following days, the confirmation came. The remains were those of Egbert Rimkus and Cornelia Meyer. They had not stayed with the vehicle, which was the conventional wisdom of the time. They had decided, in a moment of desperation that no one can fully reconstruct, to walk. They had traversed over 3 miles of some of the most punishing, broken ground on the planet, attempting to reach help in a direction that led them only deeper into the reach of the desert's cruelty. But the resolution was incomplete. The desert had returned the parents, but it had kept the rest. Throughout the long years of the investigation, and in the days following the discovery of the adults, the search for Georg and Max continued, but it yielded nothing. To this day, the 2 children have never been found. There were no artifacts left behind to mark their final path, no sign of where the desert had finally claimed them. They remain, in every sense that matters, part of the landscape itself. This is the final, irreducible truth of the desert. We try to map it, to quantify it, to bring the missing home. But the desert is a ledger that only it can balance. It is vast, and it is old, and it is entirely indifferent to the names we give the people it takes. Whether they are lost in the dunes of Colorado, the slot canyons of Utah, or the mountainous heat-blasted basins of California, the result remains the same. A person walks in, a life is interrupted, and the geography simply folds over them, leaving the living to contend with a silence that never ends. There are no ghosts here, only the immense and terrifying scale of a world that does not require our presence to exist. The parents were found after 13 years, but the children were not, and in that final, unanswerable absence, the desert reminds us of what it truly is. A place that does not need a reason to hold on to what it takes, and a place that, when it chooses to keep its secrets, keeps them forever.